Can you hear it now, Alain?
Oh, so I should. Yeah. Okay.
Perfect.
All right.
Sorry for
Okay.
this.
Okay. Anyway, I don't think that's the first part is too important. But anyway, just to say that this is when last year was when the first books came out in English in mainstream publishers about this. They were all very soon out of date because what happened, these are two of my books that came out last year. What happened basically was that we had these diffusion models that came along and rendered the previous model, GANs, out of date. So all the illustrations are all out of date. And I guess these diffusion models started kicking in. Actually, the very beginning was roughly May of last year, but not available to the public until July. But anyway, so this is all very, very recent. I want to just address some basic questions, and my apologies for those who are experts here, but sometimes it's important just to go and touch on the basic things, talking about where it came from, and then kind of looking how it's being used in architecture. I want to touch on the dark side because I think there is some terrifying about it, and then offer 10 predictions about the future of AI that may or may not be useful to an architect. So I think, I mean, this is Margaret Bowden's University of Sussex. She was the kind of grand old lady who started talking about these things a while back. And this is her definition of AI. AI seeks to make computers do the sorts of things that minds can do, which I don't think is actually accurate anymore. First of all, because AI can do more in certain domains, such as games of chess and Go, than minds can do. And secondly, I don't personally believe that they need to do the things that minds can do. They don't need to be conscious. As long as the machine does what it's meant to do, you know, as long as your toaster toasts your bread, you don't need to be conscious. So I think that's a bit of a red herring. But let's just say that what's happening right now is this thing called the deep learning, the neural networks. On the right-hand side is the artificial neural network, and then the neural network of the brain itself. And these are called neurons, and these are synapses, and the flow of information from left to right is governed by the weights on these synapses. And these deep learning refers to the number of hidden layers. That can be up to 5,000. It can be enormous. The huge crucial difference, though, between these two is that AI is not conscious. It's not sentient. It has no consciousness. It doesn't know what it's doing. It can beat us at chess or Go. It doesn't know it's doing that at all. It doesn't think. Whether it needs to think is not the question. And if you ask most people think of AI, certainly until ChatGPT came along, they would think of this kind of thing, Sophia, the humanoid robot. Actually, within the industry, people are apoplectic about Sophia because they think that Sophia is a complete fraud, trying to pretend to be human when it's a long way off from being human. And maybe it's people have been watching too many movies like Ex Machina. And this is, whereas Sophia is trying to be human, this is a human trying to pretend that she's a robot. But if you want to understand what AI is, don't think humanoid robot, think code, think software, programming. It's essentially that. And as such, it's effectively invisible. And so in the future, Grimshaw's in the future, you won't be surrounded by humanoid robots like this, but you'll be surrounded by AI. In fact, a lot of people don't realize that, but we are already surrounded by AI. It's what's finishing our sentences on Gmail. It's what's translating on WeChat. It's what's recognizing our friends on Facebook. It's what's filtering out our spam and so on. It's absolutely everywhere. It's just that we're not maybe aware of it. And in my first book, I made this comment. It is as though the Earth has been invaded by an invisible, super intelligent alien species. So how did AI emerge? Actually, the UK has had an incredible impact on the history of computation itself and also on AI. I mentioned Geoffrey Hinton earlier on. He's British. Alan Turing was British. Charles Babbage, the designer of the first protocomputer, was British. Demis Hassabis at DeepMind is British. Stuart Russell, who's written the book on AI, he's British. So it's actually a huge amount, surprisingly, from from the UK, but it's Alan Turing who first conceptualized the notion of connecting computing to intelligence. I find the term intelligence problematic, but never mind. That was back in the 50s, as we all know from watching The Imitation Game. He didn't survive much longer. He committed suicide in 54. And this is where the term AI was coined in 56 for a gathering of the smartest and brightest in the States, including, this is Marvin Minsky, who's part of MIT Media Lab. And their idea was to solve the basic problems of AI within 2 years. Actually, it was a complete disaster. There was the whole history of AI has been a history of letdown, shall we say, of too much hype and failing to achieve those goals. When they met up again, and these are the survivors, including John McCarthy, who coined the term AI. He said, I had to call it something. I called it AI. I wasn't very happy with the term, but I had to go and call it something. Well, I don't think it's a great term. First of all, it's not artificial at all. It's synthetic, perhaps. And as soon as you use the word intelligence, you're kind of anthropomorphizing it. I use terms like learning and intelligence and creativity and so on. Apply it to AI, and it seems to be wrong. I think personally, it's about information processing. And that's what it is. But anyway, I won't get into that too much. So when 50 years later, the survivors, as it were, got back together again, and there was actually nothing to show, very little to show in the 50 years. And that's partly because, well, but by strange coincidence, it was about the same time that deep learning took off, and that's really what's revolutionized everything. So the term AI has been around since 56, but if you talk about AI in the beginning and talk about AI now, it's the same as talking about the first car and something like a Tesla. There's absolutely no comparison. And this guy, Geoffrey Hinton, was the guy who really made things happen. Marvin Minsky, I mentioned before, he's kind of like the villain in the series, right? At the end of his career, he was connected with Jeffrey Epstein, ... He also was the person who wrote a book back in the 60s trashing neural networks, saying they were not going nowhere. And for a long time, they were out of favor. And Geoffrey Hinton, who was obsessed with trying to model AI on the brain, he went to study, after studying at Cambridge, he went to Edinburgh to go and do something on working on neuroscience. And he was really convinced the only way to get to AI was by understanding how the brain operates. And there's several others in the same situation. Demis Hassabis has also did a PhD on neuroscience. But because of this kind of the dismissal of neural networks, whenever he was submitting papers, he had to kind of somehow mask over and pretend he wasn't dealing with this world of neural networks. But it was eventually around 2006, that's when it really took off, mainly because of a number of different things, but to do with the vastly increased computing power and the better algorithms. So this is what we're talking about in deep learning. It's a subset of machine learning, which is a subset of the broader category of AI. Think of them like these Russian dolls nested inside each other. But deep learning is what's happening now. And normally when people refer to AI, ChatGPT, all this stuff, it's all deep learning. And as I say, it's because of a series of factors that these things could really take off. The main one being just the vastly improved computing power and better algorithms, but other factors also kind of came into it. And for sure, although AI went through what's called a series of winters when funding was cut because it wasn't performing, now it's happening. It's certainly here to stay. And there were a couple of moments, I think, that kind of in the history of AI, which really brought it home to the general public, what was happening. In 1997, Garry Kasparov took on Deep Blue, IBM's computer, and nobody thought he would lose. One of the greatest chess players at the time, but he lost. And he made this, I think, very important kind of comment, which is absolutely true. The question is simply when. We just have to understand that everything that we know how to do, machines will eventually do better than us. And it's happening at different speeds, right? There's some things like chess and Go, clearly it's particularly good at already. But then the really, and that was a comment I made in my book, but then the really important one was in 2016 when AlphaGo, which is this UK-based, is produced by DeepMind of London, since acquired by Google. And they took on Lisa Doll, who was the kind of Gary Kasparov, shall we say, of the world of Go. And the point about this is that Go is infinitely more complicated than chess. Even though the moves are quite straightforward, there are more possible moves in the game of Go than there are atoms in the universe. So even if you put all the computers of the world together, you would never be able to calculate this. So they had to shift from the expert systems of Deep Blue, where they were literally uploading all the information about every single chess match played, to a learning system. In other words, to dealing with deep learning. And this was an exhibition in London recently, commenting on this particular match, which is really important in the whole history of AI. And this particular comment after game 2, yesterday, after game 1, I was surprised, but today I am speechless. And the reason why for that were there was a series of moves that happened, which were called slack moves. Everybody thought they were mistakes, they were glitches, they just thought that the computer's not working. But actually, many moves later, we suddenly began to realize they were strategically brilliant. And that's the interesting thing, is that we couldn't even follow what this was doing. And this particular move, move 37 in game 2, which is this stone here, which I don't play Go, but you don't put it on the 5th line, you put the 4th or 3rd line. Very unusual move, never played before. 100 moves later, these 2 black stones here linked up with it, and it won the game. And that's why he was surprised. And so even the commentators at the time just were totally confused by this. And I think I've got a video coming up. These are the Google commentators. I can't, I don't know if they could probably hear it there, but okay. All they're basically saying is, that's an unusual move. Yeah, I thought it was a mistake, but it wasn't a mistake. And I think this is the interesting kind of question, is that that it's just operating a different level. I wouldn't call it intelligence, but it's certainly information processing. And those of you who've got dogs know the range of smell and hearing of a dog far exceeds human beings, and this is what's happening. So it's not just simply that it exceeded us in terms of creativity, but you could also say that we couldn't even recognize it. It was beyond the spectrum. It was just operating at a different sort of level. And this is like why people were so shocked by this particular sort of patch. And what's interesting also is that this is happening now when they apply this to urban planning urban planning rather. This is a comment by Hovard Hoekland, who was the CEO of SpaceMaker AI before it was acquired by Autodesk. And he's kind of commenting the same thing, basically, that you know, it was coming up with counterintuitive solutions that no architect would have thought about, but actually they were much better, which is kind of disturbing in a sense. So the question then of how AI could be used in architecture, this is going back to Geoffrey Hinton again. This is recent, right? This is like 2012. They had a competition. It's called the ImageNet competition, where they were trying to see how quickly you could recognize an image of a bird. And we take this for granted, right? Because we've got on mobile phones, facial recognition opens it. But 2012, this was really, really novel. Nobody had done this before. And Geoffrey Hinton came along and showed that deep learning neural networks could do it much, much quicker than anyone else. And that's when people began to realize there's something else happening, and this is the technique we need to follow. But not only that, they then began to realize that actually, if you could go from an image of the bird on the left to the word bird, the holy grail was whether you could go the opposite way, whether you could start with the word bird and generate an image of a bird. And they discovered that actually, just by reversing the neural network, you could do that. And this produced what's known as deep dream, completely trippy images, whereby some of the information about where these things should be positioned has been lost in the process. Therefore, they're kind of, as they put it, pose invariant. They're all over the place. But you can see this neural network's been trained on what looks like dogs down here. It looks like an oil lamp and you know, serpents and things. And this was caused a sensation, partly because it's so trippy. The first ever exhibition of AI generated art was based on this technique. But the real breakthrough happened when this technique was developed, called generative adversarial networks, or GANs, where you get two neural networks, a generator and a discriminator. And the generator is taking random noise, producing an image which the discriminator is kind of judging against a training set and deciding whether or not it's convinced or not. And in that process, the discriminator is training the generator until the generator comes up with something convincing. And that started producing something truly astonishing in terms of the quality of the images. These were the first faces that were generated using style GANs. There's a whole zoo of different forms of GANs at the time. And so suddenly we had kind of reached something very special. And then I think the first architectural version of this was Refik Anadol, who's a media artist based in LA from Turkey. And we had actually in 2019, I proposed to do the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale with Zaha Hadid Architects and with Refik, and sponsored by Google, which I would have thought was a kind of dream team. Maybe Grimshaw would be better still, but we were not even in the shortlist. That shows how people were not aware of this. So and we were planning to do this, but Refik got on with it anyway, and he just started producing this and fed all the images from of Zaha buildings into this neural network and started hallucinating this an image. It takes a long time. You've got to produce thousands of images, and it's not so straightforward. You have to have some computational background to do it, so it wasn't easy, and the images coming out were not that great. But nonetheless, this was kind of historically a kind of crucial moment, 2019, when we get, I think, the first GAN-generated image of a design just emerging out of the computer. I mean, Zaha was no longer around. We could still produce something Zaha-like. And that was the result, which became the image that we put on the front cover. And then people started doing other things. We moved into cycle GANs, which is a kind of where you're working with pairing off different things. So it's not, you're not interpolating within a limited data set, you're actually extrapolating, breeding as it were. And this is a work of Cobb Himmelblau. I've already suggested the next guy you should invite is Daniel Bolajan, who is the mastermind behind this, super smart guy. And they're suddenly producing something, and this, I think in 2021, was pretty much the state of the art in terms of what you could do. It won the Cadia Award, it won a Digital Futures Award, and so on. And this was the sit. And some of the images, they're always glitchy. Right? Everything that comes out, if it's not glitchy, it means they've kind of some kind of post-production. But they're always glitchy, but they're beginning to sort of approximate buildings. And they're based on a data set of all the work that they produced in the office, which is about 1,000 different projects. So there's quite a lot to build upon. So this was, in a sense, the state of the art at the particular time. And we used it on the front cover of the AD, Machine Hallucinations, but then something different happened. And this is what we call diffusion models, which is working in a very different process. And it's all coming out of OpenAI, right? So it's all from the same kind of base as ChatGPT. And DALL-E was not released to the general public to begin with, but was already causing a sensation. And what it's doing is it's not imitating things, not copying things. It's searching and synthesizing from data that's being scraped from the internet. So there probably hasn't been a photograph of an astronaut on a horse, but it's able to interpolate that, to synthesize that, and get a horse and put what an astronaut would have been like on a horse. And that was already causing sensations, but it wasn't available to the general public. I gave a talk at the AA almost identically, the 13th of May last year, and I was talking about this and saying, when would this moment happen when architects would wake up? And Patrick Schumacher was in the audience, and I didn't know he'd been collaborating with Refik, and they started producing this kind of stuff using DALL-E, because Refik had got access to this. It wasn't open to the public at that particular time, and so they were kind of producing things at an order of magnitude better than that first image that he'd produced. And these are just 2D, but they look kind of convincing from a 3D point of view. And after that, of course, Midjourney appeared, and I know this is my stuff, but anyone could do this, right? And you can working for Zaha, you can still produce this kind of work. And I guess so from that moment on, this is when things really started picking up. I guess July onwards, people started noticing that Midjourney was producing things and coming up with things that you wouldn't have thought about. I think this is the interesting thing. It's just beyond the range of what we would imagine. I think humans are not as creative or as imaginative as they think we like to think about. And it started as it went through. The goalposts are always changing because there are different sort of models that they go through, and they get more and more refined, and gradually they get more and more sense of kind of form and materiality and so on. And this is the kind of more recent stuff that I've been producing, and I won't go into what I'm doing now, except to say that I would say always when you're using this, to always put something into the prompt that acts like the how can I put it, like the grit in an oyster. You produce this particular one. I put the name of a frog from the Amazon that has a weird pattern on its back, and it's a poisonous frog. It doesn't matter, but it produces the most astonishing images and things. So, but then there's a whole community of these, and you can go onto Instagram has been the kind of the site of choice, as it were, where people are displaying these things. And what I find astonishing is that every day these guys just churning out a new design every day, and it's astonishing what can be produced. And some of them are getting, I think you guys should look out for these in your office, right? Try and find some people like this. This is a winery in California. And there's a certain group of, I would call them super users, who now know how to control this. This is a guy called Carlos Bannon, who's a Spanish architect professor in Singapore, and he uses ControlNet to condition these things. And anyway, there are a few experts coming out who are kind of getting really good. So what's happening here? I would just go back. This is not a GAN. This is a diffusion model. But I think what we're discovering is it's kind of operating a bit like a GAN in the sense that human beings, I think, are really good discriminators. You know, you can smell a perfume, taste a cocktail instantaneously. You can tell whether it's good or not. And those of you who've been reviewing portfolios here, you probably go through them in about 30 seconds, right? But I don't think that we're so good at generators. We've got a limited range of imagination. So what's happening is that Midjourney, DALL-E, and so on are just basically increasing the range of options. They're kind of becoming a prosthesis to the human imagination. They're producing more options, and then we can choose between them. So anyway, this is, as you all know, probably has been causing a sensation. There was an exhibition in Texas recently about these diffusion models. I'm not quite sure why it's called Architecture After AI, because AI is not going away. But anyway, but I personally think this is a kind of trap, because all it's doing is producing kind of sketches, right? And what's more, the real problem about these sketches is that each one is completely different. So when you can't really produce an interior that relates to the exterior, and you can't reproduce a kind of a series of elevations where the east, south, southwest, and north elevations all relate to one another. So we need to move beyond that. And I would simply suggest that what's happening now in Core is actually taking it to a different level, where they're not basing it on images, they're basing it on parameters. And it's getting far more complex. And as a result, they actually are beginning to be able to match these elevations and also the interior and exterior. So, and strangely also going back and using GANs and many other sort of techniques. So it's not straight diffusion models, but I definitely get Daniel Bolajan in, because he's the guy who's really churning these things out. So this, to my mind, is one level of where things potentially could go. It's kind of weird, though, that a small firm in Vienna with a principal who's older than Nick Grimshaw has been investing so much time in this, because I don't know what happens when he dies. But it's not so easy to do this thing, and you need some kind of super user to really be able to handle that. Alongside that, I say there are other areas which I don't know so much about SpaceMaker. Although I was talking to Autodesk last week, but I do know about Xcool, partly because Juan Yu He, who's the CEO of Xcool, is one of my doctoral candidates. And what I can say, and I can't show you half the stuff that they're doing, but in 3 to 5 years' time, there will be software coming on stream that will completely change the way that we operate. In particular, they're trying to sort of find a single platform. So instead of having these discrete operations, I mean, at Zaha's now, you might go from Maya to Rhino to BIM to something else, and they're just having it as one platform that's going to go from data to fabrication. So that's going to be one of the kind of the ways that things go forward. They're also been testing out different sort of techniques and things, and entering competitions. They beat MVRDV in a competition recently, and I'm not saying that they're the greatest designers, but there's things that are beginning to emerge that are going way beyond what we see with these diffusion platforms. This is a kind of a topological optimization thing to do with wind comfort, whereby they're breaking down these initially rectilinear forms, and there's a kind of morphogenetic process, and we start getting, as it were, more kind of Frank Gehry forms appearing towards the end. This is not that sophisticated, but still, it's still taking it into a kind of different sort of domain. And there's work going on, and half the time, of course, you can't find out what's going on because they're not allowed to disclose what's going on. But this is the way that it's going forward. This particular project won an international competition, and then they used AI to go to reduce the number of different triangles, the kind of tiling systems on the thing. They got someone from Gary Technologies and reduced it from 1,000 to 500. Then they used AI to bring it down to 12. So all sorts of ways it's beginning to sort of open up in new directions. And then, this is another competition where they beat MPRDB. I think I'll skip this because it's much time. Alongside that, I'd say there's something else, and I don't know what it is, but my hunch tells me that the GPT system is going to suddenly produce something. You can produce a technology, but you don't know how it's going to be used. When the mobile phone was invented, they thought it was going to be for rich businessmen. But when a rich businessman would lend their phone to their daughters who were going out one evening and say, give us a call when you want me to pick you up, suddenly it changed. So you don't know what's happening. And often what's happening already with these diffusion models is people have been combining it, not only with ControlNet, but with Grasshopper, and they've been doing lots of different inventive things. And I think that's opening up in interesting new ways. I'm absolutely convinced that GPT is going to come in somehow, even though it's only based on text, and radically change these, because it writes code. That's the point. It writes code. I know that there's my friend Lei Zheng at Zahas who runs the Beijing office. She uses ChatGPT the whole time just to write letters to the clients and things, or she writes them in her very bad English, and she says, please tidy that up, and you get this perfect letter coming out. So I just think that this is going to have a huge impact. So the dark side of AI. My first glimpse of this, I think, was on boarding a plane in LAX to Shanghai, and I came on with my boarding pass, and I showed it to the flight attendant, and she said, I don't need that, just look at this panel. And all of a sudden, it kind of recognizes me, right? And it gives me my seat. And I thought, holy shit, it recognized me from everyone else on this planet. And that's when I started thinking, this is a bit terrifying. And I found myself in a sort of Elon Musk situation, because he's both kind of promoting AI in terms of Tesla, in terms of SpaceX and Neuralink and so on, but warning us that it could be the end of civilization. I think another comment that people have come up with just recently is that we all thought that, it's actually a Tesla factory, we all thought it would be blue collar workers who would be the first to go under, because you don't have any humans there in the first place. But actually, robotic arms are still a bit primitive. I mean, it's okay if they're programmed to do things very precisely, but you give them a bunch of bricks and tell them to build a wall, they'll really struggle to be able to handle that kind of thing. Meanwhile, actually, AI has been racing ahead, and now what people are realizing is the white collar workers that are most at risk, including, frankly, computer scientists. I always thought, oh, when things get bad, we'll all go to computer science, but actually AI is writing code. So there'll be predictions. We don't need computer scientists very much in the future. I wrote this thing for Dezeen, I don't know, about 2 months ago now. Somebody wrote some articles. We haven't got to worry about AI. I emailed them, what do you mean I'm going to worry about AI? That's ridiculous. And so they said, okay, write something about the risk of this thing. So actually, I used ChatGPT to write up a bit. ChatGPT is a bit vanilla, it's a bit bland. But if you say, oh, come on, ChatGPT, give us a bit more racy than that, can make it more exciting, it spices it up, right? So you end up with these kind of comments. So it's imperative that architects pay attention to AI and its potential to revolutionize architecture, or they risk sleepwalking into oblivion. Now, what was interesting about that article, I got 2 different sets of responses. Those who are working in AI said, well, that's nothing special. We all knew that. What are you talking about? Whereas those who didn't know about AI, I was so amazed by the kind of pompous comments I got. Like, there's one guy who said, there's not a single AI on the market that can possibly match my sheer ingenuity and creativity. And you knew that actually that's exactly the problem, because that's what happened, right? It went from the beginning from Gary Kasparov. Nobody thought Gary Kasparov. No one thought the least at all. And this is another quote from Jack Ma, who was until recently the CEO of Alibaba, saying, human beings can never create another thing that is smarter than human beings. And Elon Musk corrects him. The biggest mistake I see people making is to assume they're smart. people underestimate the capability of AI. They sort of think it's like a smart human, but it's going to be much smarter than the smartest human you will ever know. But the point is, you wouldn't even realize it because it's beyond the spectrum in terms of what we're doing. So anyway, as a result of that, the end of that summer, I was writing a book. I should say, actually, I initially was commissioned by the RFA Publishing to write a book about this, and Helen Castle, I worked with an AD, commissioned me, and I spent 3 weeks, and I came back with this. I said, okay, I've got the title. It's going to be The Death of the Architect. She said, well, I'm not sure our members would like that too much. Could we make it The Death of the Architect ? And so I said, well, I think it should be The Death of the Architect ! Anyway, I decided to take it away from RFA Publishing because I think they were going to look over my shoulder and try and intervene too much. And I went to Bloomsbury instead. And I was doing this book, and then I found myself compromised, like Elon Musk, talking both about how good it was, but also how terrifying it was. So eventually I persuaded them to do 2 books. And this is not actually the cover, but anyway, never mind. One with a white cover like an angel about the good side of AI, and one with a dark cover, black cover, like the devil, about the dark side of AI. Now, it's not that AI is evil or anything, right? If you can't think, you can't have any evil intentions, right? It's just a machine. But the problem with AI is precisely it is so capable. I think we're all beginning to realize it right now, and that is the danger of AI itself. I was going to put this book off until I'd written a few nice books about AI, but now it seems that somehow I should write about it. But it's not just AI, right? I think that the whole, to my mind, I mean, I'm an ARB licensed architect in the UK. I qualified over here. I just see the profession being undermined in all sorts of ways. I mean, we're no longer in charge, right? The model from Alberti about the architect being in charge. Most contracts, and I don't know about Grimshaw, most contracts in the UK already design build where you're working for a developer. So I think that the profession is already struggling, and I think AI is just going to make it worse. So that's my position. So I'm going to finish off with 10 predictions about the future of AI. Some of them a bit lame, but anyway, just to sort of comment on where I kind of see it going. First of all, and this is kind of obvious in some senses, that it's like a prosthesis to the human imagination. We become cyborgs. This is Elon Musk talking about how we become superhuman because we've got this machine extension of ourselves, and so on and so on and so on. That's fairly obvious that we're able to do far more. But that also has an implication because in terms of the way that we use it and in employment, I'll just talk about that in a moment. These two buildings will become intelligent. Cities will be controlled by AI. They're kind of similar, so I just lump them together. I think that what will the future city look like? Is it going to look like something like this, like something out of the Jetsons? I doubt it. I think the future city, personally, is going to look pretty much like the city of today. This is LA, where I'm based. We'll see a few new buildings being built, of course. But the main changes we're going to get, the existing building is going to be retrofitted with latest technology, and we're going to be using AI to control traffic. In fact, in certain cities in China, they're already doing that. So I think the digital twin will come in both to monitor the performance of a building and also to solve traffic problems. That seemed to be quite obvious. And when I produced this AD in 2009, I think it was, Digital Cities, it was interesting how architects got it completely wrong. So Patrick Schumacher, this was the first time he started talking about parametricism, and he was predicting that all these parametric cities everywhere. Of course, we haven't had any yet. In fact, all architects were talking about form. And the one article that was completely spot on was an article by Ben Bratton, who it's called iPhone City. He was talking about how the iPhone has completely changed how we navigate and understand cities, and it's about information. And I think that's absolutely crucial. So you get Mario Carpo, who writes a lot of nonsense about what's the style going to be of let's say, big data. And he read somewhere that big data is messy, and therefore we're going to have messy architecture. It's not about form. It's about information. And if you think about an Uber car, does the Uber car look different to an ordinary car? No, because it is an ordinary car. It's the way that the information has been processed that makes it so radically different. So I think the notion of informational cities is the way we should think about the future of our cities, not in terms of something out of the Jetsons and so on. This one is kind of obvious in some senses, but I think it's kind of interesting in some way because we still cling to some stupid things like passports, which I don't know, I was in Barcelona recently, and thanks to my compatriots who voted for Brexit, I found myself in the non-EU line, right? And it took an hour to get through this. And I just thought, this is ridiculous. I don't know about you, but I've subscribed to some system in the States. When I enter the States, I don't even show my passport. I just show my face, and they recognize me, and I go through in 3 seconds. So why on earth do we have passports? Why are we stamping passports? All these things could very well go. Although there is a kind of like a kind of residue. People like to keep to old systems, so maybe it won't happen as soon as it should. Clients will start to insist that their architects use AI. This is actually a comment from a Spacemaker from this discussion. I thought that was kind of interesting. Why would developers want architects to use AI? Well, firstly, I think it's going to optimize their the profit in terms of what they can get out of a site. Secondly, we make mistakes. Seldom does AI make mistakes. It's one way of checking you don't make mistakes. It's a bit like spell check. It sounds mundane, but I think that's what a lot of AI is going to be about. It's going to be making sure we don't make straightforward mistakes, but there may well be other reasons too. Professional indemnity insurance will go up for those not using AI. This is a scary one, right? So Toby Walsh is actually also from the UK. He's now in Australia. He's a computer scientist. He wrote a book called Machines That Think, which is a stupid title, but machines don't think. But he makes this one interesting prediction, which I think is it's kind of illuminating. Basically, he says we're going to be banned from driving. And his way of thinking is this, we'll get, all these kind of self-driving Ubers and things, and we're going out for a drink at night in the evening, and we think, okay, well, let's just go and take a self-driving Uber or whatever it was. It'll be very convenient, and we'll start doing that. And as we're doing that more and more, so our own driving skills will go down slightly until it gets to a certain point where actually it gets more expensive to be a human driver because you have to pay a higher insurance premium because even though Google cars and whatever it is are not perfect now, they will be. And humans will always be distracted. They will be checking their phones and whatever it is. So premiums will go up, and eventually, according to Toby Walsh, we'll be banned from driving. We're just bad drivers. And he makes this interesting comment: we will not even notice or care. I mean, that's kind of amusing one. So the question is, how does that relate to architecture? This one is also interesting because there's not much to see for this at the moment, but I know it's going on. AI will be able to generate outcomes conforming to all constraints, and I would simply mention this is a very primitive model coming out from Xcode. It's going to be really the way that things operate in the future, whereby everything is integrated, and when this thing is generating these forms, and you can change what it looks like and facades and whatever it is, it's all conforming towards building regulations, local codes, and it's calculating things in terms of the structure and in terms of the performance, the environmental performance, ... and keeping a track of cost. Now, this is a really primitive system. It's very modular and it's basic and so on. But in 3 to 5 years' time, we're going to have a system where it's going to be tracking everything and coming up with things. So everything's going to be conforming in some way. 80% of architects could lose their jobs. This is again a bit startling, but I think the point is that this was a study that was done in 2013 by these 2 scholars from Oxford, where they were looking at which jobs were most susceptible to AI, and they went through, and there's some 700 jobs, right? And apparently, if you're a recreational therapist, you're pretty safe, and you get down. And architects are not too bad, 82nd. It seems that maybe the architectural managers will be will do a bit better. They'll keep their jobs longer, but basically architects should be okay. And when we get down to like 702, well, there are no telemarketeers anymore. They've all disappeared. So that sounds good, right? We're in the top 10%. We're not going to be replaced. But actually, they're making a complete mistake here, because what they're doing is assuming it's just human beings versus AI, whereas actually what it is human beings plus AI, with this kind of prosthesis, versus those without AI. And according to Wan Yu, and who knows whether this is correct, or indeed when it might be correct or not, she reckons that one person with AI can achieve as much as 5 people without AI. Now, clearly, that's only a generalization, and there are many different tasks in the architectural, in the office that operate different sort of ways. But that would seem to suggest that possibly up to 80% could become redundant. Who knows? Licensing might become a thing of the past. I don't know. I've got this thing about RIBA and AIA. I think that's so stuffy, even though I gave a talk to the AIA last week. But what's interesting about this XCool, so I should mention XCool. Wan Yu used to work for OMA. XCool means XCool House, and in 2016 she set up this company in Shenzhen. They're the world leaders. I would also say, however, what they're doing is based on data for Chinese buildings, and I don't think XCool is going to be available in the West for some time. Anyway, what's interesting about what they're doing, they're being asked to use AI to judge competitions. Now that's interesting, because it means that basically they could also enter competitions, which they're doing already, and they're beating MPRDV and Snohetta and so on and so on and so on. But then it becomes, you think, well, okay, if they're judging competitions, then you can imagine in the end, in the future, you will be judging planning permissions and things using AI. I mean, the moment we kind of go along and pompously say, well, I'm an architect, because look, I've got the certificate, and look, I should know what I'm doing. I think in the future, they'll base it on the proposal and on the submission. They don't care if you're an architect or not. That's my sort of view. And what's more, if you've got a system that's already producing something conforming to these constraints, then you don't need to have it checked in the first place because it's already performing. That would seem to suggest that maybe we don't need to have this whole thing about licensing. And certainly there are people around, these are two British academics who wrote a book some time ago called The Future of the Professions. They don't really talk about AI so much, they talk about automation. And they're saying, well, the problem about the professions is they're just based on this kind of gentleman's agreement that architects will police the world of architecture and so on and so on and so on. But actually, when it comes to it, there are going to be other factors that are going to go and squeeze out that kind of logic. We are on the brink of a period of fundamental and irreversible change. Technology will be the main driver of the change. And in the long run, we will neither need nor want professionals to work in the way they did in the 20th century and before. And I think the important thing is they're talking about profits. Basically, in the end, it's going to be about financial kind of issues. And I can see, I guess, because we can now do things much more easily, people will be undercutting others. It'll be vicious. There'll be and the profits to be made from architecture, I think, are going to go down because it's going to be easier to do these things, and so on and so on. Anyway, their view is that we don't need that. Cost will force things out. However, I think that there is, and maybe this could apply to Grimshaw, there is actually another sector of the market where it doesn't matter, right? If you were to say that Zaha is like Prada or Gucci, I mean, you don't buy a Gucci bag or a Prada bag to save money. You do it for the opposite reason. You want to show you don't care about money. So I think that the architects still will have a role in the future, and be like a personal trainer or something. You'll boast about it and things. So I still think that there'll be a scope for the architects. This one second. This is about the licensee architect. Yeah, this is also ChatGPT telling us that maybe we don't need to have licensing might not be important in the future. So maybe I could finish off with a final sort of comment about so this is all very convenient, right? And we can do things, amazing thing. I think a one-person office could probably, submit a proposal in for a competition for an urban planning thing that otherwise would be impossible. It's amazing what we can do at the moment within our existing conditions. But things are going to change, I think, eventually. And it'll, of course, be very convenient when you're able to get AI to design a building completely autonomously. And I think that some of the question I was showing you, this thing about planning, how it's coming up with planning proposals, there are aspects of architecture I always think are very kind of functional and strategic, right? And they're logical, a bit like a game of Go or chess. And you can see that AI is very good at that. But the kind of aesthetics, shall we say, is a bit more complicated. But I don't think it's going to be so long before AI is going to, just as it knows what books you want on Amazon, what music you like on Spotify, it'll track your taste and things and be able to also deal with things with the aesthetics of things. So the fact that AI will be able to design a building completely autonomously is probably bad news for architects. So I think these are the two images I think are really important to think about in terms of AI. Once you've got a self-driving car, do you need a driver? Does that not apply to architecture? And Lisa Dole, kind of interesting because nobody expected him to lose in 2016. By 2019, he'd given up the game of Go on the basis that AI was an entity that could not be defeated. So let me just, this is my final conclusion. What architects need to design right now is not another building, but the very future of their profession. I think if we can use our imagination to imagine those possibilities, and I think actually there are possibilities in the metaverse that I haven't mentioned, that possible areas we could sort of look at, but we need to be aware of this and not be ostriches with our heads in the sand, because the world is changing and it's changing very, very rapidly. Just as an educator, one of the challenges, I mean, the real problems for educators, right? Because if they're only going to be, I don't know, 20% of the architects, so 20% of the students, and if we're going to use these tools, do we need 5 years to study architecture? Probably not. So I could see education really coming to a crunch. And the other problem really is, who is going to teach this stuff? I mean, you know, it's how could one professor anywhere be dealing with a world that is changing on a daily basis? So what we do at Digital Futures is a platform that I set up a few years ago, is that we offer this platform where we try and get the 5 or 6 best people in the world to come and talk about, give tutorials. And we had a series of 8 of these just recently. And even by the end of the 8, it was almost like, you know, we had to start again because they're all out of date. It's like painting the 4th bridge. You finish it, but then you've got to start it again in some ways. So it's almost like you have to have a global classroom. The only way you can operate is in that kind of space where you bring in the top people in the world to operate. Anyway, there is this thing which you might be interested in or not, which is on, this is the Digital Futures library at the bottom there, where we have a series of these tutorials about how do you, starting from the elementary to the more complicated, how do you work to 2D to 3D, how you, and so on and so on. So that's, I think, where we need to sort of kind of go in the future. So I would so just kind of sum up then, you know, the world is changing very, very rapidly. Maybe one thing I didn't mention was the principle of Moore's law. This was a kind of comment made by an industrialist, George Moore, in the 60s, who basically noticed that every year the number of transistors on a circuit board would double, but the cost would come down by half, which is a kind of exponential sort of increase. So you're going not 1, 2, 3, 4, but 1, 2, 4, 8, and 16, and so on. And that's been applied by Ray Kurzweil to technology as a whole, which probably explains why things seem to be speeding up. And recently they said we're going faster even than Moore's law. So it's a world which it is changing incredibly rapidly. Things are coming out that which we're not able to understand. All I would say is that, you know, I don't know what the solution is, but I think the important thing is to be kind of aware of the problem. I think once you're aware of a problem, it's not a problem by which you're trapped, but it's a problem that you can begin to deal with. And I think it's important for all architects to pay attention to that. And if this is slightly exaggerated on something, I don't know, but if 80% of architects go unemployed, who knows? But I think the point is, you need to exaggerate things to get the message across for people to pay attention, because otherwise we can have a profession that's been dominated by these people who know nothing about AI, who are completely confident that they're not going to be displaced by AI. One thing we know for sure is that no one can predict that the world in the future is going to be the same as it is today. I don't know, I was a student in Cambridge. When I look back on those days, you know, I would go on a trip somewhere. I'd go to SDA Travel and I'd queue up and I'd go and talk to a travel agent. She'd fix me up a flight, and the next day she'd put the ticket in the mail and I'd get it. And then I'd go to a camera shop. I'd buy these reels of film and I'd take them with me. Then when I came back, I would go and I'd get them processed and so on. None of those things operate. You don't send tickets by mail anymore. You don't process your films anymore. Most camera shops have gone out of business because your phones are perfectly good at taking photographs, and you can't assume that the world in the future is going to be the same as the world in the past. Anyway. So I hope that was, some people hate this, right? Some people really hate it. And some people have got this kind of Blade Runner dystopian world. They love it. They love it. So I don't know. My apologies to the former group, but yeah.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation, Neil. If anyone has questions online, please post them in the chat, or I see my laptop gone off, so maybe it's better to raise your hand and speak up. Maybe someone who is present has a question.
I have one.
Yeah, sure.
So we're saying about one thing is the profession as an architect in terms of the tools that may affect, but also was mentioned about cities and build not changing that much because it's retrofitting. And I wonder if actually that would be affected as well, because if certain jobs change or evolve, for example, COVID, that the way we relate with the city change, it may affect actually how the city behaves because of we as humans, we don't do certain journeys or.
Yeah, no, of course.
So it's basically catching up, not only with the tool, but also about how the interactions with cities may change.
Yeah. No, of course, but I just think that the sign's already there. I mean, there's this. I mentioned this. There's this company in China called City Brain, and the only evidence I've got is their own. So maybe it shouldn't be. It's not very trusted, but I think that just in terms of kind of coordinating traffic, that makes a lot of sense. But in my book, I kind of did a chapter on like brain city and how we should understand the city in terms of information processes now, and try and see it how it's kind of it's operating in a different sort of way. But I mean, there are many other factors as well, and I don't want to limit it to AI, of course, but there are many other factors. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I'm online. Hi, Neil. This is Juan in New York. How are you?
Hey,
fascinating.
I really like
Well, I think you might have been at Nottingham University when I was a student.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Fascinating talk. And I can't help, I mean, I agree with change is the only constant, apart from death and taxes. And it seems to me, and I could be wrong, that we've been undergoing a sort of digital revolution since I was at university, when we were playing around with blocks in Apple, I forget the Apple program. And then, you know, arriving at Grimshaw where everybody had a computer, there were no drawing boards, was kind of shocking already in 1996. And doing basic 3D modeling that took forever and getting a render was like amazing. To now, the new software is generating many options and images and photorealistic or whatever your style is to show clients who demand more and more. The industry, as the tools get better and faster, demands more options, more optimization, less total project cost, et cetera. So I'm just curious, listening to you and not being an expert, but thinking about AI, how in a sense, it's just more of that. No, it's a tool. It's going to get better and more capable. The industry will demand more. We will, as a society, optimize construction industry using this tool. We'll be able to, each of us, produce more, as you said. Hopefully, we'll address climate change with our with our industry and biodiversity and everything else that we need to, if we're going to survive. But I don't see a threat. I see it more as an opportunity for this progress to become real faster. Am I being Pollyanna-ish?
Well, first of all, I think the difference between this tool and those other tools is the fact that this is a tool that learns. I mean, his name, Martin Ford, gives a talk where he says, well, of course, in the past, we've had these moments when people have been displaced, or horses were kicked. As soon as car was invented, horses became redundant, right? But cars don't learn. These things are learning, and the kind of pace at which it's learning is really speeding up. So I think we're in a very novel situation. So it's not quite the same as that. And I personally take the view, and I'm not an economist, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be undercutting. That's going to make it very difficult. I mean, to begin with, we'll maintain our fees and so on, but I think that's going to go fairly soon. So I mean, it will be good in the short term, no question. We can do much more. It'll speed things up. We don't have to render all this stuff. But I just think longer term, there must be some problems down the line. We had a discussion with Patrick Schumacher, and he was convinced, no, it's going to be a problem. We're going to have actually got much more work that we need right now in the metaverse and so on. I don't think you can be confident about that. I just think we need to get wise to this and exploit its possibilities so we can use it for our advantage rather than have people taking over from us. I mean, just one thing I do think would be kind of interesting is that what's happening is these silos are breaking down. That I can design fashion now. It looks pretty convincing to me anyway. But that means fashion designers can design architecture. So all these things are breaking down. I think one thing that we could actually get into, this came out of discussion with Autodesk, was that we could and should become developers, because developing will not be such a mystery anymore. I mean, you can just go these days and go to ChatGPT and say, how do I start up a developer group? And I think the safeguards, the checks that you're going to get from AI are going to keep you fairly sort of safe. So I think we have to seize this moment and use it to our advantage. And that would be one area I think because architects could, because we always got to pay much less than developers, right? And, I suspect there are opportunities out there, but we've got to be critical about these things and not just base it on our own kind of pompous sense of how important we are as architects. I don't know.
No, that's right. I mean, I agree with you. The being aware of it and embracing it and kind of using it and going with the flow, no, adapting. The whole industry will adapt. The developers will also be threatened in some of, the staff that they need will be less. I think hopefully it becomes a way to optimize an industry that is way inefficient compared to many other industries. And you think of a factory building cars is now a handful of humans controlling the robots with the software. So, and maybe that will even optimize further, but we're so far from that right now in the construction, where every building is a prototype. But I take your point about eyes wide open.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the one, like what I had in mind. Mainly my question was, so I usually bring the example of the GPS, for example, the Google Maps, right? So, before Google Maps, people were able to kind of orient themselves in the city quite easily. Now, like you ask someone, where's north? And like they kind of look at themselves, So like, I guess my question goes towards there. I'm very much an AI advocate. I teach that to my students. And I very much see though that, for example, the ChatGPT, right? So students nowadays writing their dissertations, for example, using ChatGPT. And I kind of miss the point, and personally, I very much feel that you're missing kind of the learning curve there. Sure, might not be needed after some point if AI kind of covers all that for us. But for me, I personally very much like, and mostly, honestly, I'm just asking for your opinion here. Like, yeah, that learning curve on the human side, right? How do we learn, even writing code? I'm a coder, like looking into these millions of pages of documentation. Usually, yeah, it's a hassle, but that's exactly what kind of makes me the developer that I am, right? And being able to kind of bring all this knowledge and actually find the relevant parts and actually reuse them after a while. So yeah, I guess like that is a bit of the, what I'm questioning about all this.
Yeah, well, I mean, firstly, I'm based in LA, right? And it's having iPhones and things just completely transformed things. I mean, first of all, most streets in LA go from 1 to 10,000, right? And you can be in the same street, but you can be like 60 miles away from it, right? So it is helpful to know exactly where it is. Secondly, before there were certain areas of LA you couldn't get a taxi because there weren't taxis. Now you can get an Uber or a Lyft pretty easily. So, but I think the question about it's an interesting thing because I mean, I also got my students are using this the whole time. They're producing stuff with it, and they're generating text. They're getting since it's easier to go read it out, and they've got the images. They're all producing this kind of stuff. There was a case recently in New York where they banned ChatGPT from classes. You think, well, what's the point of that? I mean, first of all, I mean, they'll be able to. You can even. I know there's a program there you can detect whether it's from whether it's to be generated by ChatGPT, but there's also another program that can confuse you. So I mean, you will never be able to fully detect that thing. But it's also kind of pointless. You think about it. How long ago was it when there was discussion about banning calculators in a maths exam? I mean, to my mind, the question is, well, once you've got calculators, do you need to do math, log division? Which then the question is, well, what do you need to study as an architect when you've got all these things? Do you need to learn rendering these days? Or, all these kind of questions. So I personally think that there's no going back to the past, and we need to sort of try and engage with these things. And I'm sure there's going to be some slimming down and trimming in certain sort of areas. I don't know, maybe it's easy when you come from a generation where you had to, I mean, we had parallel motions when we were in Cambridge and studying, which is ridiculous. And they banned computers from the studio, which kind of meant that there was a whole generation of graduates who went out and were unemployable. So that was the only effect of it. But when you think about that, I mean, one of the problems I think with parallel motions is I mean, take something like the Sydney Opera House, where you kind of, the problem was that Jorn Utzon does his sketch, but the engineers don't know what he's sketching, right? So they had to break it down to a section of spheres and so on. So, I think there are all sorts of benefits from being able to track these things and computationally sort of follow them and so on. So I'm not nostalgic about the past. I mean, I thought it was a ridiculous time, that we had to live through. But I don't know, and I also think that, there's also a comment, I don't know, I always think Prince Charles is King Charles, sorry, he's kind of like, but he used to come with these comments like, oh, these students today, they're all this Beavis and Butter generation. They can't spell, they can't add up, The point is he wasn't able to recognize what they could do. You don't need to spell when you've got spell check. You don't need to add up when you've got calculators. But the new generation are kind of doing multitasking and things, and they're inventively doing certain things. And that's what I think is going to happen with this world of AI. You're going to get these people combining these different softwares in radical new ways. I mean, it's already happening already. And that's why I'm saying I'm not so sure that ChatGPT is not going to be part of that future, because who knows how people can combine things. So, I mean, I think your students have probably got the answer. I don't know what they say, but
I guess they very much utilize it in terms of the ease of use, honestly, right? Because like for us, writing a dissertation was a 3-month period, and now for them it's like let's put another iteration in next week, In that front, honestly though, like what I'm keeping out of this, it's mostly that kind of also the learning of us as kind of also that senses, right? Yeah. So yeah, we used to learn math in order for us to come here and kind of understand the geometrical structures. Maybe that's useful now, and we need to all go down the prompt engineering. I don't know,
Yeah. No, I don't know. I was when I was finished at Cambridge, I was a translator. I translated Alberti from Latin into English, right? And a colleague of mine who was at Emmanuel College with me, he set up the world's biggest translation process firm, right? And he sold it last year because he could see that Google Translate was going to rule out the whole of translation. So, we've got to be aware of these things. And,
I guess on that note, and similar, I think, like I read an article by Ted Chiang, he's the New York Times contributor, saying we need to find the right metaphor to understand how this is going to impact us. And he kind of says AI is going to be like the management consultant, the person who comes into your office and is like, well, what do you actually do here? And then starts to optimize towards savings, like you're saying. Like AI is going to push every firm to maximize profits, cut overhead, et cetera. And it ends up prompting the question, like, what is it you actually do here? And I think architects, like you said, are going to have to figure out how to answer this question, because it becomes like, well, what is the value that we offer? And how do we convince clients to continue to use our services? And already, like, a lot of the value we offer has been given to consultants, right? Structural engineers and so on and so forth. So I guess like a skeptical view would be like, well, if you reduce architecture to the production of these computer generated images, you might get better at making the images, but ultimately we're here to make physical things. And so we need to translate these 2D images of hypothetical spaces into real 3-dimensional spaces. And I guess I'm curious to hear your view on that link, because I think the ability to create images has been getting faster and faster and easier for decades, right? Rendering's getting faster. We can model things that we can't even understand how to build. At some point, somebody has to figure out how to build it. So I guess my view, I think that is going to be where we end up providing value. But I'm curious to hear where you think, like ultimately, like the Dalis and the Midjourneys are going to get better and better, and fashion designers are going to come and try and say, oh, I've made an AI generated model of a building. I'm an architect now. But I feel like what makes our profession distinct is that we deal with the making things real. So curious to hear how you think this engages in that.
I mean, the point of AI is immaterial. It's challenging to deal with the three-dimensional materiality, but those things are coming in for sure. When you were talking, I was thinking actually that Steve Wozniak asked Steve Jobs that same question. You know, that I'm a coder. Whenever I do this, what do you do? Right? You don't make things, you don't whatever. And his response was, he said, I'm like a conductor of an orchestra. And I think this is really what architects are in some senses, because we're not really specialists in structural engineering or at anything in particular, but we get that overview. So I guess a kind of curator or a kind of an orchestra or something like that could be the way forward. But I think we need to take charge of it. Would be my view. I mean, just sitting back and waiting for commissions and so on, or waiting for development. I think this is why I would say, rather than saying, oh my God, seize the opportunities. And I don't know if I'm talking nonsense when I'm saying that architects should become developers, but I don't think it's that far away. And why are we waiting for them anyway?
I mean, the article in question says that basically, like, the personal computing revolution increased the productivity of society, right? Gross domestic product of the planet has increased significantly.
Yeah.
But in the Western world, the average wage and net worth of the people working has not changed.
Yeah.
So the value that's being increased is going to the people who have capital, which of course in this case is the developers. So ultimately, who's going to develop from all of these improvements in the current way of working is people who are making the projects, the developers, right? They're the ones who ultimately are providing service.
I think in the end, there's a big kind of social, political, economic question that needs to be addressed because because actually, it's like, you give up architecture to go to something else, you're almost jumping from one lifeboat into another because they're all going to sink at some point. And I think the real problem, I don't know if your accent's from Canada or from the States, but I mean, the States has got a huge problem because, it can't deal with, minimal wages or any kind of social structure. I think Europe is in a much better position from that point of view, but it's going to really hit the States. And there is huge disparity, obviously, right now, especially in California places. So I think we're going to have to introduce some social controls to make sure that some people don't fall through the cracks.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's
Yes, just to get your opinion, it's not related to architecture, but just artificial intelligence or even AI in general. What makes us different as humans? Is it feelings? Is it years and millions of years of evolution? Is there diversity? I mean, I want to know what you think. Like, what's your
I mean, people sort of say, I put so many feelings and emotions into my design. It's got to be better. I mean, when you said forget your own feelings and emotions, it doesn't make it better. But I think the problem right now is that we are comparing AI to us from our position, right? And we're saying it can't think like us. It's not sentient. It hasn't got this. Until it's going to do those things, it's never going to be as good as us. I think if we were to take the opposite perspective and say, okay, so these technologies process information incredibly efficiently. We don't try and compete with a calculator, right? That does it better than us, but this is a learning version of that, And if we sort of try and put it from that perspective, I would say that we are pretty inferior at processing information compared to what AI could do. We need to recognize that. So I think we got to stop being. I think there's something I wrote about once. Is that we need to have a second Copernican revolution. The first Copernican revolution, the universe doesn't go around the Earth. The Earth is going around the sun, and so on. We've got to realize that we're not the center of things. We've got to step back and recognize that and accept that. So humans are very, very arrogant sometimes. I don't know. What do you think?
I think our diversity is very special. With algorithms, for example, you can scrap something and write it from scratch, right?
Yeah.
You can't do that. We're the result of, if we do something a certain way, it's because of millions of years of evolution that makes us do something a certain way. And I think that's very special when it comes to humans. And by feelings, I meant like how Damasio looks at feelings. Do you know what I mean? So I think
I didn't,
knew yours much.
I know Damasio quite well because I was teaching at USC. But you should look at Anil Seth. You want to take a neuroscientist, and we were talking about this before. He's at the University of Sussex. He's got the most incredible TED talk. Anil has got his father's Indian, ANIL is family, SETH. And he's got like 14 million hits on his TED talk, and you can understand why when you hear it. And he makes Damasio look a bit old-fashioned, frankly. And so his view is, Daniel Seth's view is we hallucinate our reality, and it's absolutely mind-blowing. We also had a series of discussions with neuroscientists on digital futures. Those guys are wacky. They're completely crazy. So there is a new way of thinking. I find Damasio a little bit old-fashioned personally. Who cares about feelings and things? I don't know. He's certainly, people in neuroscience are a bit skeptical. Yeah. Nice guy though. And he loves architecture. He used to live in a Mies van der Rohe building in Chicago.
Maybe keeping an eye on time. We have. Yeah. Room for one more question.
There was one online.
Is there one online?
Oh, there's something in the chat. I noticed there's a whole thing in the chat here. Oh, Karen in Shenzhen. Okay.
Hey, yes, that's a question from me.
Hi.
Because I'm currently in Shenzhen, so it's nice to hear like AI is being developed also quite a lot in Shenzhen city. It's just like something also quite new. For example, Shenzhen city is sort of trying to push for facial recognition for to replace the ticket machines, start from metro, but you can also see, airports and then high-speed rail station. And then today, even I can, if I get a Coke, I can pay by my face. So it's, it's happening. But I don't know, my feeling is really, is that safe? What about the future? Like if this gets being used, widely, would that be a sort of security issues, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a professor in Tongji, so I kind of follow what's going on in China. I'm well aware you guys can buy things in a shop, and there are going to be challenges and things, but I think that's the future. And I certainly think passports are so stupid. That's what I would say. I mean, yeah. Actually, there's an very interesting kind of book that's comparing by Kai-Fu Lee, comparing Shenzhen to Silicon Valley and which one is going to be the better one. And Kai-Fu Lee reckons that Shenzhen is going to be the leader. What is interesting right now, of course, there's this big kind of battle going on between the States and China, and this chip act where the US won't sell chips to China. It's going to be China's going to be right up there. And just a kind of comment you're probably aware of, because everyone in China knows about that AlphaGo match, right? And President Xi made this kind of comment right after it that China would want to be the head of AI by the year 2030, and it's getting pretty close to that. But I would also say that I think everyone in China was taken surprised by OpenAI, and that's a challenge to overcome at the moment. But no, I think that China's going to be right up there. I know how hard you guys work and how intelligent you are. So China's going to be. I mean, and just to say that Tongji, where I teach, is now number 12 in the world for architecture, and some of the old schools are dropping down, and these new Chinese schools, Xinhua and so on, are becoming much more prominent. So yeah, maybe China's the future. I don't know. Although it's a bit scary when everyone knows what you're doing, right? That's the problem. There's another one here, Sun Zhenji. Oh, you can't see anything. Okay, thanks for the amazing talk. Quick question regarding the database information NEI is trained on. What are your thoughts on certain biases for architecture? How can we extend the database it's training on? So first of all, bias, the problem of bias is a human problem. AI gets its bias from humans. But this is actually, you've got to get Daniel Bolojan in, because what he's doing is saying that already in those platforms there are biases. You know, Midjourney and DALL-E have got aesthetic biases. You need to replace them with the biases of your office, you know, and take charge of that. So you've got to basically be kind of constructing your own database, which is not so straightforward. But so just let me see if there's any other one. The question up here, I think that might be the. Oh no, okay. Oh, you recorded it. I hope so too. Oh, a question about sound. Okay, well,
No, thank you so much. Like super interesting.
it's to be continued, but I would just say that if you do want to find out more about it, this digital futures thing is absolutely, it's free, right? That's me being a European socialist, right? I got this view that's kind of like education should be a human right and not a privilege of the wealthy. So we made this thing available. And what's interesting is people come along and we say, we're not being paid anything. We're not going to pay you anything, but we can share your passion for architecture. And people are doing that, you know, and there's this resource. And frankly, in terms of AI, you need to have this kind of global platform where you can get this thing. So please make the most of that and have a look at what's going on there, because that's the only way to find out about these things, because they're changing so rapidly. So anyway,
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I hope that was useful. It's just to go and
Thank you very much.
thank you. Thanks. Okay.
Yeah, probably the topic is too much to cover in just an hour. But
Yeah, it's